Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Classics Revisited webinar series. I'm going to just give it just a minute or so for people to come in and get settled. As you come in, feel free to switch the chat over to everyone so that everyone can see any comments you make, and feel free to write in the chat where you're coming from and where you're listening from today. We'd love to hear from you. Once again, I'm going to just give it a few more seconds for people to come in and get settled as they transfer over from the waiting room. We are so happy to be continuing this great conversation and providing a work break with more great titles of our world. We're going to give everyone a few moments to get settled. While we do that, once again, please set the chat panel to make sure you're sharing with everyone. This will let us know. We'd love to hear from you, and this will, of course, let everybody see where you're coming from, and feel free to put in that chat panel where you're coming from today. Today, we will delve more into theoretical philosophy and politics as we journey to the highest sanatorium in the Swiss Alps in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Published in 1924, and his first novel published after World War I, Mann's The Magic Mountain was a work that gained quick acclaim. A truly philosophical and theoretical look at the rise and fall of philosophies in the world as it was known pre-war. It is a book well worth reading, especially as we come into those winter months. We are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion, and would love to hear all of your questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. Today, I once again have that great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Michael Sugrue to our ongoing webinar series. I know many of you know where Dr. Sugrue hails from because you've watched many of these episodes. But for those of you who are just joining us, Dr. Sugrue is a professor. He is a graduate of the Great Books program. He earned his BA in history from the University of Chicago and his MA, Masters of Philosophy, and PhD in history from Columbia University. Professor Sugrue has taught at prestigious universities such as Princeton, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and many more. My name is Christy Goebel. I'm a global marketing specialist here at Bibliotheca, and behind the scenes we have my colleague Mackenzie Crane, helping to make sure everything runs smoothly. She'll be chatting to you in that chat box and sharing some great links related to the book. We will be sharing that chat log with all attendees, so make sure you switch those settings to everyone. If you have specific questions, please use the Q&A panel. The like button does help float the most popular questions to the top, so please use that feature if you see a similar question or something you do want answered by the professor. Once again, we are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion, and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. Feel free to start writing them into the Q&A panel before the lecture is done. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to write them in as we do the Q&A. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Michael. We have recorded his reflections in advance, but Dr. Sugrue will join us at the end to take questions. I hope you enjoy The Magic Mountain.
Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, is one of the great achievements of 20th century literature. I think it's widely agreed that Joyce and Mann are the two most important 20th century novelists. And it's easy to see why Mann deserved a Nobel Prize for literature, because his novels are novels of ideas and cultural concern and political and psychological complexity. And The Magic Mountain is a kind of composite. It's a Swiss sanatorium at Davos, but it is also separate from what are called flatlanders. The people in the sanatorium are sick, but they seem to never get better. Some die, including death by suicide, but it is a place of disease, both literally. Hans's has tuberculosis. And figuratively, it is a place of cultural disease. And in that sense, it's a representation of pre-World War I Europe. The novel itself ends with the main figure, Hans Castorp, leaving the sanatorium. Implied is that he is going to go and volunteer for the First World War and that he will get killed there. So he's a representation of a culture that died off in the First World War. Remember that the First World War was a crisis of faith. It was a recognition of a certain kind of spiritual bankruptcy, which drove formerly self-assured Westerners to question the value of the West and of themselves. So the Magic Mountain is an exploration of sickness and health. How do you characterize? How do you know one from the other? In that sense, it has deeply Nietzschean resonances, because Nietzsche was more inclined to make differentiations on the basis of sickness and health than he was on the basis of good and evil. All kinds of references, particularly references to the German high cultural tradition, run through it, references to Wagner, and in particular, references to Goethe. So Thomas Mann has an enormous debt to Goethe, and his Magic Mountain is a place where we can get a vista and see the whole rest of the world. Or another way of describing it would be that representatives of different stances towards the world come to the Magic Mountain, and we encounter them, and we see what their ideas translate into in terms of sickness and health and life and death. The Magic Mountain is a Bildungsroman, which means that it's a novel of education or a novel of development, like, well, Tristram Shandy is a sort of Bildungsroman, a comic one, or The Sorrows of Young Werther is a Bildungsroman. So is Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Here, we're going to encounter the development and the maturation of Hans Castorp. And the two great influences on him there are going to be two radically different figures. The first is Ludovico Settembrini, and Ludovico Settembrini is an Italian who represents Enlightenment values of progress, of rationality, of optimism, and of humanism. And he is a learned intellectual, and his opposite is a very strange figure. And this very strange figure is Naphtha. Now, Naphtha is a sort of monstrous figure because he is simultaneously a Jewish Jesuit who is also a Hegelian Marxist. That is no easy feat. Many of us juggle incompatible ideas, but here we're working really hard at that. Now, the point here is that Naphtha is based upon a real person, in the same way that in Thomas Mann's novel, Dr. Faustus, Adrian Leverkuhn, the main character, is based upon Arnold Schoenberg. Both are musicians and both are pathbreakers. Here, Thomas Mann is again writing from life. And instead of basing it on Schoenberg, Naphtha, the Jewish Jesuit Hegelian Marxist, God help us, is a representation of Georg Lukash. Now, for those of you that don't know his work, Georg Lukash, along with Antonio Gramsci, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, put together a kind of composite Hegelian Marxism that was very different from the kind of mechanical, reductive Marxism that we had in the First International with people like Plekhanov. So Gramsci is often understood as kind of one of the leading lights informing the development of leftist movements like the Frankfurt School for Social Research or critical social theory. But probably equally important would be Georg Lukash. Lukash was, among other things, a literary and cultural critic, and they had a very cozy relationship. Lukash said that the greatest of the bourgeois novelists is Thomas Mann, and Thomas Mann used to say that Lukash is the guy that really understands my novels. So they scratched each other's back amusingly, but apparently Lukash did not recognize himself in the character of Naphtha. Now, who is Naphtha? What does he believe? He believes in archaic impulse. He believes in ritual and blood. He is deeply medieval. He is suspicious of reason, and he is dismissive of the idea of progress. Now, I'm not going to give you a spoiler here because it's arguably the best single scene in 20th century literature. But 600 or 700 pages into this, as we near the end, we have a final showdown between Settembrini and Naphtha. And this is so good, so jarring, that I honestly have never met anyone who has read that scene who was able to keep on reading. In other words, everybody, as far as I can see, 100% of people, when you get to that scene, it's so overwhelming emotionally that everybody puts the book down and walks away from it because it's just too much. The showdown between the Enlightenment and the Middle Ages, or between rationality and mysticism, or between optimism and pessimism, or between, I don't know, any of the humanisms and theocentric view, which doesn't allow for humanism. Their showdown is worth reading the 700 pages that leads up to it. That's all I'm going to tell you. It truly is an astonishing novel. You wouldn't think the human mind could do that. Now, there are others who, again, are people or other ideas behaving as people, like Madame Chachat. She, of course, since her name is Hot Cat, represents eros or sexual desire. She is the seductress. There's Mynheer Piepercorn, who is a wild man. He's the force of the irrational. And he contrasts with both Naphtha and Settembrini because he is outside of their scale of certainty claims. Instead, he follows the irrational, the impulsive. He likes seducing women. He likes sensual indulgence. In some ways, he's like Dmitri in The Brothers Karamazov. And Hans Castorp is interacting and borrowing ideas from all of these people about the impulsive part of life, the desires, what Plato called the bronze part, but also about the rational part. And in that final conflict between Settembrini and Naphtha, which is, again, one of the great achievements of Western literature or literature anywhere, we'll find out about the spirited part, the silver part of Plato's soul. Which one is the wholesome and life-affirming, as opposed to life-destroying stance towards the world. Thomas Mann's novels are always epic in scale. One of the things that's worth considering is that although novels can be about relatively small and perhaps sometimes trivial subjects, the greatest of the novels reaches in the direction of epic. That's certainly going to be true when we look at James Joyce's Ulysses. But it's also true that Thomas Mann is self-consciously writing novels of an epic style. His novel, Dr. Faustus, is about the diabolical agreement that was made, not just between Dr. Faustus and Satan, but between German culture and Nazism. And when he looks at, and when he writes Die Zauberberg, the Magic Mountain, what Mann is doing is surveying all of Western high culture before it was subverted and destroyed from within by the First World War. That was the event which caused the West to no longer believe in itself, which caused a kind of spiritual bankruptcy and kind of put it up, weariness, which we're going to see particularly in post-World War II Western culture. A new pessimism sets in. And Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain ends ironically. That civilization, that culture is about to be destroyed by World War I. And no one knows that there's going to be an ironic Nostos, an ironic homecoming. And what that's going to involve is, instead of coming home and creating moral and political order the way Odysseus does, Hans Castorp, after absorbing the culture of the West pre-war, voluntarily goes into the war and does not come out. So what we have here is destruction and self-destruction at the individual and cultural level. And so this is a kind of elegy for the Western cultural tradition as it existed in the age prior to August 1914. In some ways, it's congruent with the quip that Virginia Woolf made that sometime around 1910, human nature changed. Well, Mann, I believe, would agree, and he would say he would locate the time much more precisely with the beginning of the First World War. Mann's Bildungsroman is about Hans Castorp, but it's also about the West. It's about motion towards destruction and self-destruction. And so there's a pessimism that is gnawing at Mann here, because remember that the main focus is on various kinds of pathology, both individual and civilizational. And it's hard not to come away with the feeling that Hans Castorp's death is the product of a civilizational pathology, a conflict between Settembrini and Napta, which results in destruction and self-destruction. In some ways, it's a metaphor for World War I itself. Thomas Mann, well worth reading. I encourage those of you who have the time and the inclination, you couldn't spend it any better than reading this as an introduction to all of Mann's great novels.
Thank you so much. Michael, if you could join us by turning your camera on, that would be great.
There we go.
There he is. Hello, sir. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. So, we have some questions that came in via registration. You've answered most of those in your lecture. And I would encourage anybody, as we go through the discussion, to fill in some questions into the Q&A. We would love to talk about it. But I have to start with, wow, this is a beast of a novel. You've definitely given us some work to do in the last 4 months of the year with Moby Dick and Brothers Karamazov, and then we got to Magic Mountain, and let me tell you, it's slow moving, but it hits you the further in you get.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed about Mann that you and I talked a little bit about before the webinar started, and what I've heard from people who are more familiar with Mann than I am, is that he's very man versus self, and battling inner demons. All of his characters tend to spend way too much time in their heads. Could you talk a little bit about just like kind of themes and his writing style? Because a lot of his books tend to be more introspective than action oriented.
That's a great point. These are psychological novels that always adhere. I mean, Mann's style doesn't change in the sense that it always adheres to a pretty strict realism. So we don't have any angels coming down, no miraculous crap, no spiritual transformation the way you get at the end of Crime and Punishment.
Yeah.
Instead, what we get is heavy symbolic weight being carried by the various characters. And so what we get is people or other ideas acting like people. And so the most important characters are always important because they represent some particular stance towards a big question. What's the best kind of life? What is human nature? What's the best kind of political order? All of those get addressed by Mann at various times. And along with Joyce, he's one of the two greatest novelists of the 20th century. And although he and Gareth Lukash kind of scratched each other's back, I mean, it's a fair judgment by Lukash. He genuinely is great. And it's just one of those funny ironies that's maybe one of the most acute critics of the 20th century was not able to see himself in a novel that Mann gave him before it was even published. So he had criticism of it, but didn't see himself. And that's that lack of self-understanding, which many people, I mean, I had a pretty good idea of Mann's intellectual circle when I read the book. So when I look at this, I think this is Lukash because he didn't know Gramsci. But the idea is that this is a radical who is both a medieval thinker and an archaic thinker, because he rejects reason and the Enlightenment, but he's also the thinker of the totalitarian future. And that's kind of mind-boggling, that the future is in fact much more like the past, and that the liberal humanism of Settembrini, which will give you liberal democracy, that's a thing which is very fragile.
Yeah.
And if we look at the First World War as being discussed in this duel between Settembrini and NAFTA, there's one stream of Western thought which is looking for a fight and looking to die gloriously. And that kind of crazy nihilism is true of, say, the heroic traditions in epic. I mean, think about somebody like Achilles.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. On the other hand, we have the more cultivated human and humane values of Settembrini. It's not an accident that he's an Italian. You think of the Italian Renaissance, the flowering of culture, the great works of art and literature that come out of that. He's the other element. The problem with him is he's idealistic, right? Which is why he's willing to fire in the air, all right? Yeah. His life is on the line. He could have lost it there, all right? So his moral beliefs understandably require that under certain circumstances, he put his life on the line. He did it successfully in the discussion in the duel with NAFTA, but implicitly,
like Hans Castorp, he is going, or that stream of Western culture is going to also join the First World War because of their idealism. The idealism doesn't last very long once you get trench warfare, but there are a fair number of people, like, for example, Woodrow Wilson, who go into World War I with all these idealistic plans. In other words, you could think of Settembrini as being the intellectual representative of Wilsonian liberalism.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, with Settembrini, going into that topic, like, one of the things that I noticed about him in the beginning was that he was annoying. Now, he kind of grows on you the more you realize really what he's talking about, but he is a talker. They even reference it a number of times when you first meet him. And is it that idea, like, is that kind of Mann's take on idealism and progressiveness, is that it's more talking and ideas than it is action oriented? Like, progressives, some people will say they're full of ideas, but they have no way of figuring out how to make those ideas happen.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Settembrini is a bit of a blowhard. And so it takes some time getting used to his secular sermons about how much he likes being reasonable. Look, I got it very early in his discussions of the world that he sees people as rational animals, and he has an optimistic view of human progress and stuff that's going to get shattered by the First World War.
Yeah.
And the failure of this Enlightenment tradition is signaled by the fact that it created a world war. Before, we didn't have sufficient technology and sufficient communications to figure out how to create war on this level. That's part of the, how can I put it, cultural malaise that begins after the Treaty of Versailles and extends past 1945. Mm-hmm. In other words, for the previous 400 years or so, Western Europe, not all of Europe, Western Europe, 5 or 6 countries, dominated the globe.
Yeah.
And the reason why they no longer dominate the globe is the First and Second World War. In other words, World War II was the war that ended colonialism permanently. Once colonialism is over, they don't have these colonies anymore to squeeze. The states of Western Europe that had their empires, like France or England, are like the coach in Cinderella at midnight. They shrink back into the medium-sized countries they are, and they no longer have the global reach that they do. So there's a sense that we have destroyed what we created. And while the third world, the colonial world, wasn't able to destroy Western culture, the Westerners themselves were.
They collapsed
right?
on themselves.
And then what did that leave but the peripheries, which is Russia and the US?
Yeah. Moving a little bit away from the war parallels and everything, with Thomas Mann, some of the research that I read was, his wife had actually gone to a sanatorium, and he originally had intended The Magic Mountain to be a short novella, not necessarily a sequel to, I think it was Death in Venice that I read, but just like a follow-up type of an idea. And it ends up being his longest novel. And it ended up taking him, I want to say, about 10 years to write, because of course he paused for the war itself. Can you go into a little bit more about Thomas Mann, his background, life, like what his political reasons were and history in that sense?
Yeah, he was a bourgeois German intellectual. He was born into a family of some means. He was deeply immersed in the German cultural tradition in particular. He wasn't lacking in the whole Western cultural tradition as a whole, but he knows Goethe, for example, very well, right? He wrote 2 novels that are actually extensions or extrapolations from Goethe. No, it's a funny thing. If remember The Sorrows of Young Werther?
Yep, we did that one earlier this year, I believe.
Mann reimagined that Lotte survived that event, and he wrote a novel called Lotte in Weimar. Here, she's an old lady reflecting back about her life, particularly crazy Werther.
So, I mean, that's actually kind of a funny and ironic take. And he also wrote a novel called Dr. Faustus, which is a take on the Faust tradition. And what he said, and the idea is that German culture made a bargain with the devil when it accepted Nazism. And at the end, he says, we deserve to be destroyed. And he did this just after the war. So that's a powerful indictment of one's own culture. I hope we never get to that point. So novels, Mann's novels are always politically engaged, but never ideological. He's not defending some dogma. He's actually living in a much more complicated world than that. And that's what makes it so gripping. Somebody once said that poets said novelists are the unelected politicians of the world. Mm-hmm. And in a way they are, because they create our thoughts and our images and our myths. And like it or not, we think in the terms that they help give us.
Interesting. Well, going into the type of novel that Magic Mountain was, a number of articles and reviews that I was reading, and once again, you know, most of my literary background stems from my theater background, and it really did represent, and it was related to a comedy of manners in that type of style. The comparison coming from the broader satirized social manners of the time, and look at a class that congested around and heal. You know, there are definitely other parallels in this form of comedy. I wanted to get your thoughts on the humor Mann uses in the book, maybe some of his other books as well, and statements he is making on different classes at the time. Because in the classes in Magic Mountain, I'm talking like, you know, you have the flatlands, and which is basically everybody, but then you have those that can afford the sanatorium, as well as just essentially sit around and think and talk and heal.
That's right. We have the independently wealthy who are at the sanatorium. We have doctors who are experts in health, not just in managing particular diseases, because they all speak one way or another to the spiritual health of everybody there too. So there's a kind of bleeding of spirituality or psychology into the medical establishment that they have there. This is symbolized by going up the mountain. Here we're going up a magic mountain. Well, what's more, I mean, it sounds like it could be something from Wagner. You know, we're climbing the magic mountain, and what are we going to find there? Well, I don't know what we could find there except the magic people and the magic sanatorium. And yet this is given to us with the strictest realism, right? No symbolic snake in the garden. There's just, Madame Chauchat. And look, the comedy that she and Mynheer Piepercorn put on is like the comic relief you see in something like Measure for Measure. Yeah. This thing's so heavy and so leaden. You need someone doing it relentlessly in the background just to give us something to laugh about while we take our mind off the fact that this is a collision of ideas that in some ways reminds me of a collision of icebergs. The novel moves really slowly, but these things are gigantic. You got to give them a break. But on the other hand, when they hit, they really hit. And neither of them is the Titanic. Neither of them is going down. So they're going to destroy each other. And that's what he's describing here. The process of Western culture deciding to kill itself in this self-imposed ritual of honor.
Okay. Now you brought her up. I'm gonna say, like, your lecture focused primarily on Settembrini and NAFTA. There we go. Could you go into? I didn't have my notes right in front of me. Could you go into a little detail regarding Madame? Is it Chauchat? How and her connection to Castorp? There are some things. Sure. Or some that, you know, think she is a third ism in the book, and I kind of read her this way in the romanticism side, and yet her character does seem to be relatively minor, maybe for comic relief in the overall plot, thoughts, theoreticals. Could you elaborate?
Okay. Yeah, she's a vestige of romanticism in an age that's not romantic. It's
Okay.
dominated by technicians and scientists at the sanatorium. But the problem is you can't keep the, remember when we read, what was it? The Bacchae, right?
Yeah.
You can't keep Dionysus out. You can throw him in jail. You can put him in handcuffs, but he slips it because he's Dionysus. And Madame Chauchat, along with Mynheer Peepercorn, are the Dionysus that slipped in and refuses to be jailed, even though they're living in this kind of, how can I put it, technically organized utopia. Now, it's just a utopia for people who have sickness, but the idea is that sickness, which you get, or which you either have before you get to the Magic Mountain, or if you're not sure if you have it, by God, everybody that comes here turns out to be too sick to leave, which really tells you something, right? These sicknesses are the initiatory ordeals that heroic heroes go through. So Hans Castorp is going to make his pilgrimage up the Magic Mountain. He's going to find out that he thinks he has a head cold, but no, he's got tuberculosis and he's got to stay 7 years. All right. So again, remember when I said that there's a strict realism and at the same time, there's a heavy burden of symbolic stuff. All right. So he's got the 7-year jail term where he gets a disease, or he gets a disease when he shows up, apparently, and now he has to work off his sins. And also remember, there are 7 stages in purgatory, right? Yep. That's mountain 2, right? Yep. Back to the Purgatorio. Mann certainly is. And what we're going to see is Hans Castorp rise up, but then join implicitly. I mean, it's not directly said, but the implication is he's going to be one of those anonymous millions that gets sucked into the big meat grinder of World War I, and he's not going to come out. That's the Settembrini in him, right? Yeah. So Naphtha doesn't make it through and doesn't want to, because he wants to die in this contest, in the contest of the duel. Settembrini would like to live, but will not kill. That pacifism is also going to die.
Yeah.
And then where the hell are we?
It comes to, so this is kind of going back to the question I just asked and going forward, Hans's illness was probably of greatest intrigue to me in the first few hundred pages. At first his mild, symptoms that appeared, I could have written it to like almost elevation sickness, which, could be mirrored in his, leaving the mindset of a flatlander and starting to take on other ideas, thoughts, philosophies, influences, etc. The reason for originally extending his stay is it seemed less about sickness and more about the girl, essentially, and being the contingent there, because there was intrigue there from his side, and he hadn't quite answered all of his questions when he decided to stay. But how would you classify his illness? Was he ever actually sick, or was he so overwhelmed by these new thoughts that he needed to stay? Sickness of the mind, perhaps, or like, people can convince themselves that they are sick. And I want to read, before you answer, I want to read this quote of an article I read. There is a chilling ambiguity as to just how much of Hans's illness is genuine and how much the result of going native. Indeed, Hans positively revels in his status as one of the horizontal.
Yeah, there we go.
There was a lot in there, sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. There's a certain masochism and rejection of hedon, and which takes there's a rejection of hedonism, which takes the form in Naphtha of a certain sort of masochism, of liking blood sacrifice and stuff like that, thinking that the flowing of blood ennobles people. And so he makes a sufficiently good case for it, so that part of Hans Castorp is taken up by this. And at the same time, he's a man of contradictions. You can't take it all up. I mean, how can you follow his path and be a Jesuit Jew? I mean, what sense does that make? He has a cloak that has that satin lining and it looks so lovely. And this somehow is unpriestly. And he turns out to be a priest of a different religion. a sort of Marxist priest, right? He's a priest of revolution, because what Marxist ideology was trying to do by abolishing the division of labor and abolishing classes and abolishing ideology is to return us to the state of equality and sufficiency that we had before the division of labor. In other words, for Marxists, the division of labor is the fall of man. What we want to do is get back to that prelapsarian point. And that's why the future for somebody like NAPTA looks so much like the archaic world, right? So we have that set of myths transformed into Marxist lingo, or into 19th century or 20th century revolutionary lingo. And the connection between Marxism and Christianity, or at least certain strains of Christianity, become really good there. Now, it's NAPTA believes a Christian because it allows him to be a fanatic, not because it requires him to be a fanatic. He loves the idea of being a fanatic, and if he weren't a Christian, he'd be a fanatic about something else. All right, and the problem is that's what we're left with after Nietzsche, just will.
So, but when it comes to the illness and everything, is Castorp actually sick, or is he just now there? I don't want to say out of laziness, but out of fear. I mean, in a sense, he's almost like that middle person of an argument. Like, you know, it's that knot of a rope that needs to go past a certain point to win the tug of war, which essentially breaks, which is what starts a war, because nobody can compromise one way or the other. And so he's just stuck up there being sick, but ultimately not very sick.
Okay, yeah, he's pretty lively for a guy with, you know, chronic desperate illness. I think the question of whether he's really sick or not is uncomfortably like the question of whether Hamlet is crazy or not.
Fair. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Yes, he is crazy. Yes, he is sane. Yes, he is a combination of crazy and sane. Or if you want, he can be other, because I don't know what to say about him. And I don't see how I could pound the desk either way and say, you know, this is the answer. It's deliberately and intentionally ambiguous. So is Hans Castorp sick? Yes. Is it a sickness of the mind and body, or body? These end up being meshed and indistinguishable.
Okay.
So his sickness, whatever it is a metaphor for his psychic spiritual sickness. And it takes a while to find that.
All right.
Also, remember Nietzsche's distinction. Remember, Zarathustra likes to climb mountains and stuff?
Yeah.
The distinction between lowlanders and flatlanders is deeply Nietzschean. There are us few mountain climbers who get to see the big picture, and everybody else is livestock.
Okay. That helps. That helps. Moving a little bit off of the symbolism and more to the history, I do have to say that sanatoriums have always kind of intrigued me. The Schatzlab is a real place in Davos, Switzerland, and was one of the main influences for the Berghof, which is the sanatorium in the Magic Mountain, and was the only sanatorium mentioned actually in the book as an actual real place. Could you talk a little bit about the use of sanatoriums, especially in the beginning of the 20th century? Why did people go there? Why did they stay for years on end? That isn't a fictional fact that Thomas Mann just created for the sake of the book. It actually did, you know, it is historically accurate, not only in Europe, but also in the States. But I've always been intrigued by the mindset of sanatoriums and why people, you know, would read them.
Really interesting
or
question.
Go there.
And notice that they are, to a great extent, a European phenomenon, right? That we don't see much of them outside Europe. They exist, but they're not as seen as often. Yeah. And the part of it is geography. The mountain air was thought to be clear and clean, and that was good for people. Remember, this is that early in the history of medicine, it was thought that many diseases came from bad air. Right, that's what malaria is, right? So if you can go to the thin mountain air, the idea was that was really good for you because it was pure and clean. So it would clean your body out. the second thing is that sanatoria are class-based. All right. This is for the upper class. Regular people have to go to work and do the 9 to 5, whether they're feeling chronically ill or not. And regardless of whether it's psychosomatic or not. All right. For the working class, there's a clear difference between physical and mental illness. All right. They have to go to work as long as they're not physically ill. All right. They can feel spiritually drained. They can feel the dark night of the soul, but they still have to go to work because they have to eat. On the other hand, you have the money to pay for your ennui. If you're like Mann, the scion of a North German mercantile firm, right? So that means that you have a life without the necessity of working. And that means you can go and get the baths at Baden or at Bath in England. And it means you can go to the sanatorium after that. And it also means that you could separate from your spouse on account of your illness in a way that was regarded as decent in late 19th century, early 20th century upper class Europe. Some people were actually sick, and maybe it did help some of them, right? Maybe there was something in their environment that was actually making them sick, which is not at all impossible. Remember that how things like lead poisoning can come from things like the glazing on tile. All right. So remember, if they don't know how to figure these things out, people may be in an environment that's bad for them, even though it's beautiful. All right.
It's interesting that you bring up the classes, because Castorp, the main character, he goes into like his history, and really, by all intents and purposes, he should not be of upper class. Like, he was an orphan at a young age. His grandfather and his father obviously had some money, but his uncle, there was some, you could extrapolate that his uncle kind of screwed him out of some of the inheritance that he should have had, because he invested it in his uncle's son. So his cousins got the investment, but he did go to university, and he was about to start a career as an engineer, which would be probably a middle class type position. But he was still living off of inheritance, and minimal inheritance at that, which was always surprising to me, that he could spend 7 years up there when his uncle had basically said, you're going to have to make your own way in the world. Yeah.
I think the theme here is the squandering of one's patrimony.
Okay.
Think about what that means for the onset of the First World War.
Yeah.
Throwing your money away on the very dubious project of making yourself healthy, which is the new Nietzschean idea of good or excellent, once you give up the idea of virtue.
Okay. That helps a little bit. Yeah. I was just amazed with that. And then with you talking about the class structure, it was something that caught me off guard with everything, because you go into a very in-depth history of who Castorp is and how he's related to, I always want to say Joaquin, but that's probably more of the Spanish pronunciation than the German pronunciation. But yeah, it's that idea. So I have two final questions for you. One is, go ahead. Sorry.
When he leaves and goes into the First World War, he may well be tapped out. In other words, he's the best man.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. So I have two final questions for you. One is a little bit lengthy, but something that I came across preparing for the webinar was an article writing in the Harvard Crimson place earlier this year. It was published in February of 2021, and it discusses why the Magic Mountain is still relatable today. It goes into the perception of illness and quarantine, relates it to the COVID quarantine that we've all had to do, whether or not we've been sick or not with COVID. And that time is a big factor in this book, and does flow in very different ways throughout the book, as they keep saying in the sanatorium, time flows differently. The quote, to quote this article, the Magic Mountain works right now because it recognizes that time is what we make of it. It's easy to come out of the book as a pessimist. Hans wastes his time, never quick enough to find love. That is a dark ending, but Mann never advocates giving up. how do you feel Mann used time to discuss the philosophies and thoughts he introduced in the book? And do you think that time was almost a character of its own in the book? Because it is referenced by almost every character in the book as an essence of what's happening up on the mountain.
Yeah. You could look at Heidegger's roughly contemporary thinking that resulted in being in time, right? How is it possible for us to exist and constantly being in a state of transformation? I think the nicest way, or the slickest way, is to treat time as a Kantian a priori form. And what Mann does, I think, is take that form and force us to notice it as things occur in the novel, because the time of the novel is not the time of nature, all right? There are two ways of thinking about time. You can think about time from the outside, which is what physics does, right? T1 and T2 and T3 along a linear arrow of time. Okay, what the inside of time is like is very much more malleable, all right? And it's also much more unique to the experiencer. If you were to get the self-portraits of Rembrandt, I think there are 8 of them, but I could be wrong. And if you were to put them in chronological order, all right, you could learn a lot about the interior experience of time that you can't find out by looking at an atomic clock.
Yeah.
Why? It's a different kind of time. It's time from the inside, okay? Now, time from the outside is constantly going on, and that's the index of what we're all doing. We all have to come back and play in the public arena after we retreat into our own private experience of time dilation or time shortening, or even the abolition of time, which happens in certain ecstatic states, perhaps. But I don't see time as being so much a character as I see it being a concern of each of the ideas pretending to be people, to extending what kind of reality, what kind of being we are. It turns out you can't keep Dionysus out. Euripides was right. On the other hand, even if you have a scientifically run organization, it's hard to tell the hard science from the psychosomatic madness.
Okay, that does help. Yeah, one of the things I also noticed was, you have 7 chapters, and almost going in that he stays up there 7 years, and so I was kind of assuming that like each chapter was a year, and it's not. Like you're at chapter 4, and he still hasn't finished his first 3 weeks.
Right.
And they're fairly quick chapters. The first 4 are, and then the last 3 are really, that's where time does progress in each of those chapters. You count some years, and you have moments of time in there. But yeah, it was just a very interesting article to read, for one, but then also relating it to my experience reading the novel and realizing that every character references it in some way. It's an interesting perspective as how, because all of us say that, time's moving really quickly today, or time's dragging on today. I mean, we all have that same perspective, depending on how the day is going and how the year is going and month, and so et cetera, et cetera.
Many parents have had the experience of taking notice that the days go slowly and the years go fast.
Yeah.
If you watch kids grow, it's true.
It's true.
But that doesn't happen in physical time. That's internal.
That's internal, and it's a relative thing depending on what you're looking at and how you're looking. So my final question before we sign off for the day is, in my research, and it's one of those that has to happen on a book like this, but it appears that some translations are a little bit easier to read or more referenced, or that or you get more depth out of those translations. Do you have a favorite translation or a recommended translation?
When I was 23, I spent time preparing for graduate school by preparing German translations. And what I found out is that Walter Kaufmann is a far better translator than I'm ever going to be. So I don't generally, particularly because use it or lose it. Now I'm an old man, and I don't know if I could order breakfast in German. So what I would say is any of the translations will do fine for a start, because it's not the translation that's daunting. What's daunting about this book is that it's a commitment, like the other books that we've covered.
Yeah.
And that's why I like this series, because in some ways it's funny and incongruous to do a 20-minute lecture and a 40-minute discussion about these gigantic whale books. I mean, they're all Moby Dick in a way, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that I needed to have all the detail of all the characters in this novel, in the same way that I'm not sure that I needed to know all that much about whales in Moby Dick. But there it is, and there is a certain greatness to it, despite the fact that some people may find it kind of loose and baggy. I think that contributes to the charm. But that's because I like long novels. There's something very German or very Russian about having a thing start out as a novella and end up being 800 pages.
That's
right?
true. I was amazed to read
Scots
that was supposed to be a novella.
Right. If you think about what their intellectual culture is like, very precise, very concise. Think of Hume, right? I mean, he could write a treatise, but even then he's trying to be as economical as he can. The great romantic profusion that you get in certain Germans and certain Russians, I guess it's an acquired taste, but I love it.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Once again, it has been a pleasure. I love talking about these novels with you, and you've definitely helped inspire me to read some of them that have been on my bucket list for quite some time.
Go ahead, make the commitment.
Well, it was definitely an intense novel, a lot of thinking to do, but I would recommend it. Some of the articles that Kenzie shared in the chat, take a look at them. A lot of them give you reasons to also read it if you weren't convinced by our discussion today. If you're enjoying the Classics Revisited series with Professor Sugrue, we will have our final Classics webinar of the year, where we will discuss James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a fantastic novel, and I'm actually looking forward to rereading it. That's the one I had read before this.
Great.
It will also conclude our section of short lectures on big novels, at least for this moment. If you have enjoyed today's webinar, Bibliotheca is continually adding to our virtual event lineup. We invite you to view all of our on-demand and upcoming events online at bibliotheca.com. We actually do have a webinar coming up tomorrow. Make sure you check that out. And then navigate to our Insights and Trends blog. And make sure you are subscribed to receive webinar updates by navigating to the bottom of any page on our website and hitting subscribe. As always, we do have all of Michael's lectures with us on a playlist on YouTube. You can share them with your patrons. We did make them public instead of gated only on our website, so that the public can also see, enjoy, and listen to them. And finally, as we finish today, we would love for everyone to complete a quick survey, even if you've already completed it. We love to hear feedback, especially on each and every lecture. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for potential future webinars, please let us know. We love to hear from you, and do use your feedback to continually evolve the webinar series we offer to libraries around the world. Just a reminder, we will circulate the chat log. It's been a long day already. The chat log and links to resources in our follow-up email. So keep an eye out for those in your inbox. And have a great rest of your day, Michael. Thank you again. We appreciate it. And thanks so much for joining us, everybody. We have a great day.